at sort of saying to official organisations, whether it's the BBC over the Russell Brand and the Jonathan Ross affair, or whether it's to the authorities involved in the sort of Baby P investigation at the moment, that's not appropriate. That's not an answer. Why haven't you done this? A much more belligerent and testing questions, perhaps of a press office, rather than. I mean, some of you may be attending in different countries around the world, and you know that depending on the regime that you're operating under, there are many countries where it's just simply not easy or sometimes possible to ask those kind of questions sort of government sources. So, I mean, as you say, John Humphrys particularly has got a reputation for, asking difficult questions of cabinet ministers, and one of the reasons for the Today programme, having established itself on radio with the reputation it has, is that obviously politicians particularly, and cabinet ministers in particular, are very good at avoiding answering questions, and therefore do need some taxing, intelligent journalism to put them on the spot. Having said that, as a couple of you have just mentioned, that there are times when certain types of interviewing style are inappropriate or seem unduly belligerent. Where as Jen sort of said, we can come across too negatively as well, too strident, not allowing somebody to answer the question before we go on to ask the next one. And I think that sort of brings us back to the whole question of, back to interviewing style, interviewing techniques, and so on. So we spoke about an unfolding scenario like Mumbai, and we sort of said, breaking story, who, what, sort of when, where, and so on, and practical questions. Once we've got the basic information, there's then the sort of, the next step. Who do we need to contact? Often the emergency services, the police, fire, and hospital, ambulance. In the case of an air crash, the airline, the airport authorities, air traffic controllers. And again, something some of you asked about earlier, obviously it's part of a journalist's job not to become an expert in any particular subject, but an expert at knowing where to go for information. And I mean, this is something that came up, has been very obvious in the recent Baby P stories in the paper, that I had a class that week who had been looking at the structure of sort of children's services and the way that they sort of tick. And the problem that we have, certainly I think in this country, but in every country I think it's the same, people aren't generally familiar with the nuts and bolts of local government and central government, and who are the regulators and so on. And suddenly a breaking story like the Baby P story has suddenly put national papers in asking exactly those kind of questions. Which is the body that is responsible for regulating different aspects of our lives? What's the role of Ofsted in this particular case? What's the role of the Commission for Social Care Inspection? What's the role of the General Social Care Council? What are local safeguarding children's boards? And unfortunately, every aspect of government, whether it's sort of education, planning, transport, and so on, tends to be quite complicated. So obviously one of the things that we're trying to do with journalists, and it's difficult because in the early days, it doesn't seem like the most interesting subject that they're going to be tackling But clearly, I think once they get their teeth into a story, or they see something unfolding, like the Baby P scenario, which has just this week obviously led to resignations now, illustrates the need that a couple of you have been echoing in your questions or comments there, that we do need to get to grips with the bodies, the way that society ticks, and who's responsible for regulating a particular area of our lives, whether that's, and of course the government's gone and invested millions of pounds of public money in various commissions, whether it's the Gambling Commission or the Lottery Commission or the Information Commissioner's Office and so on. A lot of the time information is readily available, but as ordinary members of the public, we often don't actually know how to access that information, or indeed what our rights are. So obviously in interviews, I think a lot of the time journalists are in the business of explaining to our readers, informing them about processes as well, so that whether or not it's if the breaking story is a vote that's being made by the UN Security Council, then I don't think we're patronising our audience by explaining to them, how does the Security Council work, and who are its members, and who is able to vote, and so on. So I think we see that in the broadsheets a lot of the time. We are performing different levels of information, if you like. We're informing in a straightforward way in some ways. We're interpreting. We're often balancing, and sometimes probing and exposing, and even campaigning. In terms of who we turn to for interviews, then we've spoken about representative groups, but often our contacts will be people who, for one reason or another, are better qualified to answer the questions that we've got. They might include academics, they might include pundits, sort of market researchers, experts in a particular field. In some stories, it might mean a psychologist, or the editor of a specialist magazine, or an official spokesperson for a regulator or a government department. We might want to ask an aviation expert, for example, about the safety record of a particular type of aircraft, if there's just been an air accident, or a collision investigator about what sorts of things they'll be looking for, and for possible causes. We won't expect them to know the cause yet, but people are often sort of wanting to know, well, what processes would you go through to investigate this particular type of incident? That's where I think journalists are good at thinking about who they can speak to, whether it's a military aircraft expert, or somebody from the Civil Aviation Authority, or somebody with a knowledge of the safety record of that type of plane, or experience of that type of sort of situation. We'll obviously be looking at our archives too, the history of the airline, the airport, past stories, just as we would do if there was a crash on the motorway and we want to find out if that stretch of road has had a number of different problems in the past. Just picking up a couple of questions that you said. If I can come back to Judy's one about leading sort of questions a little bit closer to the end, and because obviously that's the sort of next step. What do you do with the difficult, tricky interviews and so on? In terms of the question about do publications have a house style for interviews, obviously some publications have a house style about the sort of length and format and so on. So that, you'll know that in some tabloids it'll be a very straightforward style in terms of question and answer. In some cases that there are, we see this on television a lot, a format of the programme doesn't really often allow much scope for in-depth sort of questioning. There are, Steinway's asking about sources. There are a couple of useful sort of books out there. So there's one, Interviewing for Journalists, that you could look up on Amazon that might be helpful in that respect, certainly if you're coming at it from scratch.